Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something pretty complex, something that's been discussed a lot, the origins of COVID-19. We're specifically going to unpack the COVID-19 lab leak theory.
Exactly. And our main guide for this is the big Wikipedia article on the topic, COVID-19 lab leak theory. It's really thorough. It gives a good overview of the hypothesis itself, the arguments for and against, the evidence people point to, and the whole political and social context around it.
Okay, so that's our source material. And our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is to really try and understand it. We want to explore that core question.
Yep.
Did COVID-19 start from a lab accident, or was it a natural jump from animals? We're definitely not taking sides, just laying out the different perspectives from the article. So where do we start with this?
Well, I think the best place is the dominant scientific view, which the article outlines clearly. Zoonosis. Basically, most scientists think SARS-CoV-2, the virus, started in bats. And then probably it moved through some intermediate animal before it got to humans.
Right, like we've seen before, you mean?
Exactly, yeah. Similar patterns to SARS-CoV-1, MERS-CoV. This isn't a completely new idea, this animal-to-human transmission.
Okay. And the article brings up the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan quite a bit. That seems key.
It does. It was pinpointed as a very likely epicenter for the early outbreak. The source details environmental evidence finding the virus there and genetic evidence suggesting animal-to-human spread happened at the market.
In the market itself, were specific areas highlighted?
Yeah, particularly sections where animals known to be susceptible to this kind of coronavirus were kept or sold.
And these intermediate animals, the middlemen you mentioned, any specific candidates?
Uh-huh. The article lists a few possibilities that have been looked at. Raccoon dogs, mink, pangolins. These have all been considered. The idea is that the virus likely adapted naturally, maybe first in bats, then perhaps adapting further in one of these intermediate hosts.
So it evolved, step by step almost, to become infectious to humans.
That's the prevailing theory, yes. Natural adaptive evolution.
And I remember seeing headlines about some big studies backing the market origin idea. Does the article cover those?
It does, yeah. It specifically mentions two important papers in the journal Science from July 2022. These provided pretty strong epidemiological and genetic evidence pointing towards the Huanan market, not a lab. They looked at, where the very first human cases clustered geographically, and they analyzed the genetic sequences of the earliest virus samples. It all seemed to point back to the market as the starting point.
Okay, that sounds quite compelling on the zoonosis side. But then there's the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the WIV, that's central to the other theory, right?
Absolutely central. The fact that this major lab studying coronaviruses is located in Wuhan, where the outbreak first gained attention. Well, that proximity immediately fueled the lab leak speculation. And the article confirms, yes, the WIV was doing research on SARS-like coronaviruses from bats.
You can see why that connection would be made just geographically.
You can, definitely.
Yeah.
But the article adds some important context there.
First, lots of big Chinese cities have labs doing coronavirus research. It's not unique to Wuhan. And second, outbreaks often start rurally, but only get noticed when they hit a big city with better surveillance, like Wuhan.
Ah, okay. So statistically, an outbreak emerging near some lab in a major city isn't that improbable.
Exactly. It can be more about the density and surveillance in a city rather than a direct causal link to that specific lab, maybe a coincidence of geography.
Right. So beyond just the location, what are the main arguments the article mentions for the lab leak hypothesis?
Well, another big factor was the Chinese government's initial response. The perceived secrecy and lack of transparency definitely fed suspicions. Plus, there were allegations swirling about undisclosed research on DAT viruses happening at the WIV.
Undisclosed work.
Yeah, that would raise eyebrows. It certainly did. And then you get into the virus itself. Some proponents point to specific genetic features. The article mentions the furin cleavage site in SARS-CoV-2. This particular feature isn't found in its closest known viral relatives, which some saw as suspicious.
A unique feature. Okay.
And related to that, they highlighted two specific CGG codons within that site.
Yeah.
The argument being that the CGG sequence is supposedly used more often in lab settings, maybe hinting at manipulation.
That's getting very technical. Sounds like a detail that could be interpreted different ways.
Highly technical, yes, and definitely open to interpretation, which we'll get to. The article also brings up the former CDC director, Robert Redfield. He publicly stated his opinion that a lab escape was the most likely origin.
What was his reasoning?
He cited how efficiently the virus seemed to spread between humans right from the start, And also the fact that at that point, no intermediate animal host had been definitively found.
Okay. And the WHO, what was their stance according to the article?
Well, the WHO Director General acknowledged that the lab leak idea needed more investigation. Basically, they couldn't rule it out because the data wasn't complete. The initial official WHO-led mission report called a lab leak extremely unlikely. But importantly, the Director General himself later said that more data was needed to be certain and calls for further study.
So, a bit of nuance there. Initial report leans one way, but the door wasn't completely shut by the leadership.
Pretty much. But then the article lays out the counter-arguments and the scientific skepticism towards the lab leak idea.
Right, let's hear those. We talked about proximity already.
Yeah, the statistical point about labs in cities.
Yeah.
But crucially, the article stresses there's just no direct evidence that this specific virus, SARS-CoV-2, existed in any lab anywhere before the pandemic officially started.
That seems like a pretty major missing piece for the lab leak theory.
It is. And regarding those genetic arguments, the furin cleavage site, the CGG codons, the article explains that scientists have pushed back strongly on those interpretations. They point out that the CGG codon sequence does appear in other naturally occurring coronaviruses, so its presence isn't necessarily a smoking gun for lab work.
Ah, so it's not unique to lab environments.
Correct. And the furin cleavage site itself, the consensus view explained in the article is it likely arose through natural recombination. Viruses swap bits of genetic material all the time in nature. It's a known evolutionary mechanism.
So nature could have invented that feature itself.
That's what many virologists believe, yes. And addressing Dr. Redfield's point about early efficient transmission, the article mentions virologist Stephen Goldstein countering that. He explained the virus's spike protein was just inherently very effective at binding to human cells, which could explain the rapid spread without needing a lab origin story.
Makes sense. What about the follow-up WHO investigations? You said the Director General wanted more study.
He did. The WHO proposed further audits, including looking at labs. However, the article states that China rejected those subsequent audit plans.
Okay, that adds another layer of complexity. What about things like the Mojiang mine incident or the RATG13 virus? Those names come up.
They do. The WIV investigated an illness outbreak among miners in Mojiang years ago, and the RATG13 bat virus was discovered from samples related to that investigation. Some theories tried to link RATG13 to SARS-CoV-2's origin via the lab, but scientists cited in the article emphasized that RATG13 is actually quite genetically distinct from SARS-CoV-2. It's not a close enough relative to be easily engineered into the pandemic virus.
Too different, basically.
Too different to be a simple starting point for manipulation, yes. And then there's Project Defuse.
Right, that DARPA proposal.
Yes, a grant proposal submitted to the U.S. agency DARPA. It involved the WIV and proposed certain genetic modification experiments on bat coronaviruses, including inserting features like furin cleavage sites. But the key point the article makes is that the proposal was rejected. There's no evidence those specific controversial experiments were ever actually funded or performed.
Okay, so it was an idea that didn't happen, as far as we know.
As far as any evidence indicates, yes.
Wow. Okay, this is intricate. And inevitably, as the article points out, politics and social factors got heavily involved.
Massively involved. The lab leak theory really took hold in the U.S., especially amplified by conservative media and political figures. It became a significant point of tension in U.S.-China relations.
And the article links belief in the theory to other things, too.
It does. It mentions studies finding correlations between belief in the lab leak theory and, unfortunately, things like racial resentment, anti-Chinese sentiment, and susceptibility to other COVID-19 misinformation.
So it became tangled up in much broader issues than just virology.
Completely. It got woven into narratives about bioweapons, about deliberate release things far beyond an accidental lab escape. You had political leaders like Donald Trump pushing the lab leak idea quite strongly. While at least initially, the bulk of the scientific community leaned towards natural origin, though later, President Biden did initiate an intelligence review into the origins.
And the whole gain-of-function research debate got dragged in, too.
Absolutely. That became highly politicized, making it really difficult to have a calm, objective discussion about the actual science and safety protocols involved in that type of research.
What was the outcome of the U.S. intelligence review? Did they reach a conclusion?
According to the article, the intelligence community was divided. Different agencies had different levels of confidence in both the natural origin and the lab leak hypotheses. No definitive consensus was reached. It mentions a 2025 CIA assessment, reportedly leaning towards a lab leak, but with low confidence.
And a Trump administration webpage from 2025 apparently endorsed the lab leak view more explicitly.
So even the intelligence world couldn't definitively settle it, highlighting the lack of concrete proof either way, perhaps.
Or perhaps highlighting how intelligence assessments can also be influenced by the broader political context. It's hard to say for sure.
The article also mentions that this isn't the first time lab leak theories have popped up for major outbreaks.
That's a really interesting point it makes. Lab accidents have happened with known pathogens, anthrax in the Soviet Union, foot and mouth in the UK, even SARS escaped a lab in China after the main epidemic. But, the article notes, no pandemic caused by a novel virus has been definitively traced back to a lab escape, with the possible debated exception of the 1977 Russian flu.
And other big outbreaks faced similar speculation.
Yes, AIDS, the H1N1 swine flu in 2009, the original SARS, Ebola, all had lab-origin conspiracy theories attached to them early on. Theories that were later disproven as evidence pointed firmly to natural origins. It seems to be a pattern.
Almost a go-to explanation when something scary and new appears.
Perhaps, yeah. It might offer a sense of agency or blame that a random natural event doesn't.
And finally, the article talks about the fallout from this whole debate, the sort of negative societal effects.
Yeah, this is crucial. It notes that some scientists who initially maybe dismissed the lab leak idea too quickly, perhaps labeling it just a conspiracy, later had to acknowledge that, well, yes, it needed proper open investigation. But the intense politicization had a chilling effect.
How so?
Some scientists and journalists apparently felt hesitant to even discuss the lab leak possibility seriously. They were worried about being lumped in with political extremists or conspiracy theorists, regardless of their actual intentions.
So it potentially shut down legitimate scientific questions.
That's the fear expressed. The article mentions scientists facing accusations, even attacks, making open inquiry harder. It cites a Lancet Microbe editorial from August 2024 that was quite critical. It called the assertion of an unnatural origin simply wrong and blamed irresponsible journalism and political agendas for keeping the theory alive, worrying about the damage to virology research.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, following the article structure. Stepping back, what are the main takeaways? What should you, our listener, really hold on to from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway from the source material is that the significant weight of current scientific evidence points towards a natural zoonotic origin for SARS-CoV-2. Likely bats, maybe an intermediate animal, then humans, probably starting around the Huanan market. And critically, the article underscores there's no concrete proof SARS-CoV-2 was present in any lab before the pandemic emerged.
But as the article also shows, there are still gaps in our knowledge, right?
Absolutely. The exact pathway of that animal-to-human jump isn't fully mapped out. Understanding pandemic origins is vital work for preventing future ones. And this whole intense debate really throws a spotlight on just how messy science can get when it intersects with global politics, fear, and, frankly, mistrust.
So maybe a final thought for you to consider. Given everything we've discussed based on this article, the conflicting information, the different interpretations, the high stakes, what does this whole saga about COVID-19's origins tell us about that relationship between science, politics, and public trust, especially during a crisis? And maybe also, what's our own responsibility as individuals navigating this to critically assess information and resist spreading claims without solid evidence, regardless of how appealing or convenient they might seem? Something to reflect on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.